Hello, I'm Harley Schlanger from the Schiller Institute with our weekly webcast with Helga Zepp LaRouche, our founder and president. It's March 19th, 2020, and let me begin by simply saying that we had intended to do this webcast yesterday, but the sheer volume of activity on the internet has made it questionable, and hopefully we'll be able to get through a briefing today, a discussion today, but please bear with us if there's some shakiness or jumping in the picture. These are extraordinary times, and it does require a certain amount of patience and concentration. We're facing a situation which is a worldwide emergency. And Helga, we'll start with your call yesterday. You issued an emergency call for a bank holiday, which I think addresses the problem of the coronavirus and the financial crash occurring simultaneously. So why don't we start with what you said yesterday?
Well, I think the need to address the fact that we don't only have the coronavirus crisis, which is a pandemic, but we also have a clear signs that the financial system is collapsing. So that is why I issued a call to close the markets for a few days, which I will specify, in order to take the absolutely necessary reforms of the financial system, which has to start with the immediate implementation of a Glass Steagall banking separation, followed then by the other measures which we have been asking and demanding for, namely a national bank in every country, a new Bretton Woods credit system in order to restart the economy and basically concentrate on the physical economy. So this is absolutely necessary because while it is clear that now finally, after a quite significant delay, all the governments of the transatlantic sector are clearly doing measures. For example, the European Union has suspended the rules of the Stability Pact. Trump has evoked the National Defense Act. There are obviously many measures being taken. For example, the various bazookas which have been taken out, giving credit to firms, to delay tax payment, to even talk about helicopter money. With other words, handing out directly money to everybody who needs it. All of these things, are necessary steps to just keep the economy going and also calm down the population, which is really in a very difficult state of mind and physically. Many people have really existential worries about their livelihood. But this is all missing one essential point, and that is that the reason why we are in this crisis has to be addressed. And that is something which absolutely only we can bring on the agenda. So therefore, the very first step would be to close the financial markets, basically in order to implement Glass Steagall. Now, that is obviously something which requires a different kind of an approach. It requires the intervention of the most powerful governments in the world working together. And that is the need to have the summit of the United States, Russia, China, and India. And then other countries can support that. But you need a decision on the level of the heads of government to end the casino economy, to go in the direction of a world credit system, which enables a world health system, because it should be very clear that this pandemic will not be fought in one country, but you need a health system in every single country of the world. And that is absolutely not possible under the present circumstances. So therefore, this shutting down of the financial markets is the absolutely necessary first step, but it must be followed by the whole package.
Now, in saying that and looking at the importance of taking emergency measures, I think it's really important that people step back and recognize what you just said, that this is something that's been in the making for many, many years. And your expertise in this comes from your long working relationship with your husband, who forecast this back in 1971. I mean, it was clear to him back then that this is what we were facing, and yet governments missed these warnings. Uh, why don't you just review for a moment his uh, forecasting on this and how we missed the boat?
Well, my husband, my late husband, in 1971 was probably the only economist who, with absolute clarity, uh, recognized the significance of Nixon abandoning the fixed exchange rate system and abandoning the coupling of the dollar to the gold standard and going in the direction of unregulated monetarism. And he said in August 71 that if the world would stay on this course, it would absolutely necessarily lead to a new depression and the danger of a new fascism. Or you would replace the system with a completely different one, namely a just new world economic order. And then at every step of the way, whenever the financial oligarchy moved in the direction of further deregulation, uh, he absolutely pointed to the consequences of that. He predicted the crash of 87. He absolutely recognized the significance of the 97 so-called Asia crisis of being really the eruption of a global crisis. And he made this famous video on the 25th of July in 2007 by basically saying this is the end of the system, and all which will see right now will be the coming to the surface of the total bankruptcy of the system. Now, obviously, the measures which were taken by the central banks and the G20 after the 2008 collapse just amplified the problem by pumping more liquidity into the system. And now we are at the absolute end phase of that process. So he also was very much on the record saying that the consequences in the physical economy of this monetarism would lead to the eruption of pandemics. It would lead to the re-emergence of old diseases and the emergence of new epidemics, pandemics, because you cannot lower the living standard of entire continents over a long period of time without causing such breakdowns of the health system, the immune system. And that is exactly at the point we are right now. And that is why we are saying that you cannot remedy it by just, controlling this pandemic, because if you don't remove the causes, the danger is that new viruses and new diseases will emerge. So we are at an absolute fundamental point that we have to change the whole system.
And I think we're seeing some governments beginning to recognize that this is more than just a simple crisis. Macron, for example, announced the suspension of the so-called reforms that he was pushing. And Macron and others are saying we need to look into what caused the failures of the system. But up to this point, Helga, have you seen anyone yet addressing the need to reject the whole casino economy and go back to the measures that would feed the physical economy?
No, I think that the measures which have been taken by, for example, Germany, Merkel was yesterday in a TV speech where she really didn't say anything significant. All she said is, it's up to you to flatten the curve of the spread of the pandemic. Now, I don't think that that is the way to go about it at all. Naturally, what is behind that is that, all the Western governments are now confronted with the fact that the takedown of the health system of the last decades, the privatization, the shutting down hospitals, shutting down other facilities for the sake of profit, that is now haunting everybody because we have a severe shortage of such facilities. But I think that the approach which was taken by China has been a completely different one. They did not talk about flattening the curve. They took in Wuhan and Hubei province very decisive measures. They closed down the entire area of 60 million people and acted in solidarity in the whole country. All of China was supporting that. And they were successful in closing, in basically reducing the number of cases erupting newly. So they basically have it under control as for the situation in China. Now, that is a successful model. And, also Singapore and South Korea took a similar approach. And, I think that there is no reason why one cannot replicate exactly what China did if there is solidarity. Now, obviously, in the EU, that was lacking so far. There was no solidarity. And this just shows you the deficiency of the present neoliberal and liberal model of everything, the markets, the health system, the cooperation. And I think that the situation now is very severe. You can see that in Italy, which was the country which, because of its positive relations with China, did apply the Chinese model to a very large degree. But in northern Italy, in Bergamo, in Lombardy, they are now faced with the situation that the capacities simply are not sufficient. So there is de facto a triage where, not because they intend to, because the doctors and the nurses are working around the clock and they are near the point of breakdown, but they simply don't have enough facilities. So they cannot treat every patient. So this is a total catastrophe. But China, which not only successfully contained the actually concerned that it may come back from abroad because other governments did not apply the same rigorous measures, but they are providing help. They have sent medical experts to Iran, to Iraq, to Spain, to Italy, and they have offered help to any country which wants to take it. They are sending massive supplies to Italy, Spain, and France, who they regard as having shown to be friends of China. And I think that the only thing to draw as a conclusion is, stop this anti-China bashing. It's first of all completely insane. It is not justified, and cooperate. I think this is the moment where you have to work together as a human species, and China has provided the way to go. You need in this moment to learn the lesson from the Chinese approach in Wuhan, and that is the best thing the Europeans and others in the United States can do right now.
And on the question of the takedown of the public health system and replacing it with a totally for-profit healthcare, which has obviously failed, even the New York Times admitted this today. I just want to read a couple quotes from an article there where they said that it's now the EU austerity program which has left the healthcare systems unprepared. They were talking about Europe, but the same thing could be said about the United States. They said in the Southern European countries, they're ill prepared for a pandemic. They described this as tragically vulnerable, that the countries are tragically vulnerable. Now, we had in the United States a standard set with the Hill-Burton system of 4.5 hospital beds per 1,000 people, and this was taken down starting in 1974. Helga, you were talking about a world health standard. What would that take to get a Hill-Burton standard for the whole world now?
Well, you would need, first of all, you would need a crash program approach, where obviously those countries which have the capabilities would have to help those who don't. But altogether, it would mean to build 35 million new hospital beds worldwide. It would require to have the necessary electricity, which would need the creation of 358 gigawatt of new electricity, which mostly would have to be also in a crash program built. You would need the increase of clean water supplies by 40% of the present existence of the existing capabilities. So that obviously is a completely different approach, would require a completely different approach in terms of real industrialization of the Southern Hemisphere. And that brings you to the absolute point where this went wrong. And we are now at the point where we have to make a fundamental decision. Do we want to go in the direction of a Malthusian world order, which indeed would mean what the British system has been pushing, like Jeremy Warner in the Daily Telegraph wrote a couple of weeks ago, that the coronavirus crisis has a benefit, namely that it is culling older people. And that notion of culling, that you treat the human species as a herd which must be culled, this has been our attack against the British Malthusian genocide approach for a very long time. This is now what obviously is coming to the force, and we have to make a fundamental decision that we absolutely reject this idea that there are useless people, which is obviously behind some of the thinking, because the danger is that we come out of this with a green approach, with a Malthusian approach, and we have to absolutely go in the opposite direction and go for the full industrialization of the world economy. We have to have the industrialization of Africa, of Southwest Asia, and that is the key moral decision which the whole human race has to make at this point.
Now, as you said, this would require international solidarity. I think that there's still the proposal that you made, and it was somewhat adopted by others, that there be an emergency summit of the great powers. How could they act to bring about not just this new World Health Standard, but a new financial system?
Well, I made this proposal for an emergency summit of the United States, Russia, and China following the assassination of the Iranian general Soleimani on the 3rd of January of this year, because there was the immediate danger of an escalation which could have gone into a superpower conflict. Subsequently, President Putin called for a summit of the Permanent Five of the UN Security Council to establish the principles for the continued collaboration and survival of the human species. Now, in the meantime, all the governments have agreed of the Permanent Five, the US, China, Russia, France, and Great Britain, that they would agree to this. I still think that the absolutely necessary combination is the United States, Russia, China, and India being representative for the whole world, and then other countries should cooperate. And I think we have reached the point where we have to have different principles in the international cooperation. Geopolitics must be absolutely put aside forever. We have to define the common aims of mankind. We have to agree on those principles which constitute the one humanity, and that would first of all mean to establish a system of new international relations, of countries respecting the sovereignty of everyone, of non-interference, of accepting the different social system of the other one, and then agree on joint economic development programs to overcome poverty, to overcome underdevelopment. And I think the only realistic proposal on the table is what China proposed with the new Silk Road, the Belt and Road Initiative, where already 157 countries are participating in. And the Schiller Institute has already several years ago, we started to publish reports. The new Silk Road becomes the World Land Bridge, which is a comprehensive economic study of how to bring industrial development to every continent on this planet. Some of these projects are in different degrees of realization, but that would be the kind of platform which has to be agreed by the top governments in the world. And that way you could start a real economic development plan following such a summit right away. And it would mean you completely change the orientation. You stop, in a certain sense, it's like at the end of the 30 Years' War, where people recognize that if they continue, there will be nobody left to enjoy the victory, so-called. And that is the point humanity has reached right now. We have reached a point where we either become rational and cooperate, or we may not only face a dark age, but we may actually face a real holocaust of the whole human race.
Now, I think a lot of people would like to get your assessment of the so-called financial measures that are being taken beyond those that are emergency to provide care or funds for people who are losing jobs, moratorium on foreclosures, at least for a month or two. But what we see from the Federal Reserve in the United States, as an example, is a bailout of the speculators of an extraordinary level of credit, so-called credit, basically funny money. What's your assessment of that? And obviously this goes against what you're talking about in terms of a financial bankruptcy reorganization.
Well, that just reflects the intention of Wall Street to keep the casino economy going. I mean, when they bring out what they call the big bazooka, I think the Federal Reserve put in $1.2 trillion in various support actions, buying up bonds, buying up all kinds of debt, keep the derivative bubble going. The EU, the European Central Bank, has announced, I think, 750 billion. And, that is not the end of it. If they keep doing that, and there's right now the clear intention to do so, it will lead to a hyperinflationary blowout of the whole system. I'm not saying that these temporary measures to keep individual families and firms going by giving all kinds of support measures, that may be useful in the short term, but you need to end the casino economy. You absolutely have to have Glass Steagall, because this would shut down the casino economy for good. You put the commercial banks under protection, state protection. You put a firewall between the commercial banks and the investment banks and all the other operators and players. And if they have no more access to the savings of the commercial banks, or do not get bailout from the taxpayer anymore, they have to bring the books in order on their own. And if they can't do it, they have to be closed down. And that is the kind of intervention which now absolutely needs to exist, because if this thing is continuing, you will end up in a hyperinflationary blowout like it happened in Germany in 1923. And that is the complete expropriation of the life savings of the population. And that would lead to a social explosion I don't even want to imagine. So all rational people, I really call upon to support our action, that this approach, that you need a summit of the most important governments of the world, and they have to end the casino economy, and they have to adopt a system of integrated cooperation for world development. And if there is sufficient support for that, it absolutely can be done, because there is already motion in this direction. So I'm calling upon you that you sign this appeal, which will be below this webcast, and that you help us to circulate this idea, because there is a lot of confusion right now, a lot of panic, a lot of chaos. But you have to elevate the whole discussion on a much higher level, and that has to be one of unity of the entire world, and then we can solve it.
And you mentioned just ending the casino economy. I found it somewhat interesting that yesterday the state of Nevada shut down the casinos in Las Vegas. Maybe that's a good step in the right direction. Now, Helga, to come back to this question of international solidarity and why that's necessary, unfortunately, we have someone who hasn't gotten that message, namely Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, who continues to rant against China, talking about escalating sanctions against Iran, which is one of the countries that's badly affected by the coronavirus. What can you say about that? I mean, obviously, this is the opposite of solidarity.
Well, I think, President Trump has been capable of getting rid of some of his bad advisors in the past, like Bolton. And I think he would be very well advised to get rid of Pompeo. What Pompeo is doing right now in his anti-China campaign is really dangerous. I mean, the relationship between the United States and China has been deteriorating because it's very difficult to assess all of this because there's a lot of fake news being circulated right now, and one has to be very careful in assessing this. But a big question mark. Let me bring in another element of this. There is a geopolitical dimension in a lot of things. What is happening right now? There was, for example, a maneuver, a scenario played out in October last year, where the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, the World Economic Forum, the CIA, and the UN, and a couple of other institutions, they had a scenario acting out a new pandemic hitting the world with the coronavirus. And they basically came to the conclusion that this would cause 65 million deaths. Now, that was the very same day the military games. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I'll just, we'll be right back with Helga in a second. Go ahead, Helga.
I'm sorry. The war game basically was conducted in New York on the very same day in Wuhan. The military games started, and subsequently the Chinese Foreign Ministry raised the question if the virus would not have originated in Wuhan, but possibly coming from some US soldiers participating in these war games. And there's the big story, what was the role of Fort Detrick, which was closed down last July. In any case, I'm not in a position now to assess the validity of all of this. And as I said, there is a lot of psy-war, fake news, disinformation. But this whole question has now led to a brawl whereby Pompeo is continuously talking about the China virus. The Chinese government correctly refuted that as a racist policy. And this is going back and forth. And unfortunately, President Trump has repeatedly also used that language of the China virus. Now, this is very, very dangerous. And, naturally, there is also, this question of Iran. The oil price right now is at $20 Brent. And, that means the entire shale gas industry at this point is completely bankrupt. So, there is absolutely the danger that on top of this present crisis, you could have a war in the Middle East, and with the intention to drive up the oil price. So I'm just saying that we are in a situation where if this present situation is not brought under control in the way I said before, that you could really end up in a complete strategic disaster. And this is why I think, President Trump is doing a lot of positive things. He has started a very useful cooperation, for example, with Governor Cuomo from New York. There are lots of things where people overcome bipartisanship And but there is also this other tendency. So I really think that the absolute necessity right now is to go for an international cooperation and address the common aims of mankind as an absolute necessity of surviving for all of us.
Well, you mentioned earlier the period of the 30 Years' War and the end of the 30 Years' War, which led to the Peace of Westphalia. This actually does give us an opportunity to reflect on the actual nature of man, as opposed to being totally focused on material wealth, greed, making money. We actually have an opportunity to sit back and reflect on why we're here. And I think it would be very useful, Helga, at this moment of great anxiety and stress, for you to reiterate the point as to what is that nature of man, and how do we regain this concept of the cooperation among beautiful souls?
Well, I think that the medical team of doctors who worked in Wuhan, they just issued a very beautiful video and a message where they told, what incredible strain it will go through this period. But then they say that, they came out of it with the idea that what was really needed is love, that each individual human being is mortal. But what is immortal is love for your loved ones, your family, your nation, love for mankind. And that is the kind of spirit which needs to be evoked. And I think that this is really the two tendencies you can clearly see. You have those people who are for humanity, like, for example, the unbelievable work being done by the many doctors and nurses around the world and other people who help to make this situation function, and people who grow, who show humanity, which goes beyond anything which was there before. But then you also have the people who are displaying their evil nature, and I think that in a certain sense we are now at the point where we have to shed all the axioms which led to this situation, which is geopolitics, monetarism, Darwinianism, the liberal system of everything is allowed, and we have to replace it with the idea that the human species is the only creative species known in the universe so far, and that we have to employ these creative capacities to relate to each other from that standpoint, to respect the creative mind of the other, to show the kind of solidarity which has been demonstrated, especially by such doctors in China, in Wuhan, and that should be an inspiration of how we get out of this crisis.
I would encourage all of our viewers to take the time now, especially if you're off work or you have limited hours, or instead of just sitting there worrying or wasting your time watching CNN or MSNBC, go to the Schiller Institute website, go to the LaRouche PAC website, and familiarize yourself with the ideas of Lyndon LaRouche, particularly related to the 4 laws of economics, of physical economy, and also the 4 power agreement. So Helga, do you have anything else to add?
Well, I can only add that a lot of people in Italy are now going to their balcony and start singing. You have opera houses playing for free to be transmitted on the internet. And since we are in the year of Beethoven, I can only say that the best thing to get the inspiration is to listen to a lot of Beethoven. And otherwise, I really think that if you go into the archives of our website and study the works of Lyndon LaRouche, that is actually a very good advice, because we have to come out of this present crisis with a completely different approach. And I think that between Beethoven and LaRouche, you will find a lot of the inspiration needed. So we will come back with other programs as the situation unfolds. So stay tuned and help us to change this paradigm.
Okay, Helga, thank you very much.
Till soon.
Till soon.